and welcome to the Conservation and Climate Change Lecture Series. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. This lecture series is sponsored by the Wilderness Institute and the Climate Change Studies program here at the University of Montana. And this is our final speaker, our final keynote. Erica Zavaleta is joining us from California to talk about resilience. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Erica Zavaleta, who's joining us from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies. Erica has a PhD in biology and a master's in anthropology, both from Stanford University. Erica and her group pursue research to enhance the stewardship, understanding, and conservation of wild ecosystems. Her projects focus on terrestrial ecosystem conservation and the links between biodiversity and human well-being, and the implications of interacting global change for both ecological dynamics as well as effective conservation practice. Erica has published widely on biological invasion and community ecology, biodiversity conservation and climate change, grassland ecology and conservation, and wildfire and boreal forest, among many other topics. In the last few years, she's spoken to a variety of different audiences about how to put resilience into practice to make our social and ecological systems adaptable in the face of change. She works with a wide range of NGOs, land managers, government agencies, community members to bridge strong science into effective action. And I think that's what is really interesting about Erica as a scientist, is she's interested in doing top-notch science, but also in bringing that science into the realm of practice and making sure that her science informs conservation. Erica recently won the Ecological Society of America Sustainability Science Award. She's been a United States Presidential Scholar and a Smith Fellow. She's worked as a program leader and on the advisory board for the Christensen Fund and serves on the advisory board for EcoAdapt. Erica has taught field courses for wildland studies in the Glacier Institute, and she's worked as a backcountry ranger in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and as an intern for High Country News. I've known Erica both personally and professionally for nearly 20 years. And over this time, my admiration for her work, her commitment to putting science into conservation practice has only grown. And so it's really my pleasure to introduce Erica today.
Thank you, Lori. Oh, there I am. Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm really, really excited to be here. It's an honor to take part in this series, and I didn't realize I was the last talk, so I hope I can end it with a bang. So I'm here to talk about resilience, among other things, but really I'm interested in this question of how we can steward nature through climate change. And I have this quote at the bottom of my slide, and it's from Charles Darwin, who wasn't thinking about resilience or calling it that, but it really captures the essence of a resilience-based approach. And it says, it's not the strongest that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is the most adaptable to change. And although he's referring to species, we're tasked with bolstering adaptive capacity much more broadly, of ecosystems, adaptive capacity of landscapes, and then also the adaptive capacity of our institutions and our decision-making processes. And that's one of the features of resilience as a body of thinking that really appeals to me, because it asks us to think about how our social patterns and landscapes and processes map onto and interact with the ecological ones. And it asks us to think about how we need to manage both of them with intention to be able to respond to challenges like climate change. So why is this question about how we're going to steward nature through climate change important? I'm sure you've heard others talk about this earlier in the series. And so there are ethical and moral reasons, for sure, to be helping species and ecosystems cope with the stresses that we're bringing about. And at a practical level, our well-being is not separable from nature. So, particularly in a region like this in the Northern Rockies, we know we live with and within nature. Our quality of life depends on it. Many livelihoods depend on it. And, really what we're seeing more and more is that our safety depends on it. This is an image from Southwest Australia in their summer in 2009, after 173 people died in wildfires that were more intense and fast-moving than anything that people there could remember. Whole towns went up. People died trying to drive away from the flames because they were too fast. They died trying to ride out the fire in their homes because the heat was so much more intense than fires had been in the past. And what was happening is that the region had been experiencing long-term drought and really, really high temperatures, and these are both things that were exacerbated by climate change and that created the conditions for this disaster. And we know that things like this are happening in the US as well. These are just some images to remind us of some of the recent ones. In California, close to home, wildfires have been more frequent, widespread, and dangerous than in historical memory. In much of the country, we're dealing with extreme storm events more frequently and again of larger magnitude than we're accustomed to. And then widespread forest die-offs, you're all familiar with these, are occurring both in Canada and the Northern Rockies because of beetle outbreaks and other pest outbreaks, and then in the Southwest, these really, really widespread pinyon die-offs are taking place because of the combinations of drought and heat stressing forests, causing all this mortality. This picture is sort of before, as an infestation of beetles is just setting in, and then all of the gray, it's basically all the pinyon pines on these landscapes stretching tens of thousands of hectares, are gone.
We're going to move your microphone just a little bit.
Okay.
Will you take your scarf off? Sorry, we're just adjusting the microphone so you won't hear the sort of feedback. Great, so. Okay,
how's this? I'm supposed to throw this into the crowd. So, anyway. So the point I'm making here is, will nature survive climate change? Of course it will. Of course it will. But will it be a nature that we can live with, that we want to live with? That depends a lot more on what we do. And we can do this. This is a big, big challenge. And I think the greatest threat to our success at tackling it is that we do the thing people often do when they're faced with these daunting challenges. They kind of remain in denial that there's a problem until it's too late. They finally come around, when it's much, much too obvious to ignore anymore. And there's a little brief period of shock. And then at that point, because the problem is already so far along, they go straight to defeat, throw up their hands. And there's a real danger that we will do this when it comes to conservation in the face of climate change. And just to give you an example, in the Florida Everglades, for a long time, park managers were in total denial that there was a problem with pet monitor lizards having escaped into the wild, established, and started breeding in the park. And they were breeding and spreading, and people were seeing young monitor lizards as well as larger ones. And for a long time, the park managers were like, no, those are individual escapes. They can't be establishing the park. This is too different from where they come from in Africa. They couldn't possibly be establishing. Finally, there is this pivotal meeting, and this is like this little middle part here, where the evidence got laid out, and there was this aha moment that the problem was real, that there were thousands of breeding, potentially child-eating lizards in the Everglades, this widening swath of South Florida. And the problem had gotten really big. And so at that point, the hope was the park would rise to the challenge, take this on, try to eradicate the monitor lizards or something. But what happened, the response at that point was, well, it's gone on too long. It's too big to tackle. We can't do anything about it now. So, oh well, too bad, keep your kids inside, keep your pets inside, don't stick your hands in the bushes, and that was it. And we can't afford to do that. So, we can't afford to do that because this isn't just, this isn't just an inconvenience or a thing where you can sort of stay inside to avoid it. We have to face what's happening now and gather our best resources to tackle this for our own sake as well as for the sake of nature. So there are three things I want to talk about tonight. There's three parts to my talk. The first thing I want to do is to talk about why it is that nature really does need our help with this. This is not something that's going to sort of work itself out on its own. So we need to be proactive. The second is that it doesn't need our help to stay the same anymore. That's not possible now. And so I want to talk more about revising our ideas about what our goals are in managing and stewarding ecological systems in a context where the past isn't as good a reference as it has been. And then finally, I want to talk about how we get there. We don't have very much time to talk about that, but we do need to take action. And so I want to say a little bit about where the rubber meets the road. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So what's the biggest thing we could do collectively to help nature out with climate change? And I'm going to pose that question to you. What are your thoughts? What's the biggest thing we could do? Yeah. Family planning. Well, I guess if you can link that one to greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, I mean, I think I want to just remind everyone that, we're talking about how to pursue conservation effectively in the face of climate change, how to pursue stewardship and management effectively. And all of that, has to occur in the context of remembering that it actually matters. It matters a lot how much more climate change occurs. And you already know that. But, every 1/10 of a degree of temperature change that we can avert goes a long way to making it easier for us to steward ecosystems through climate change with a minimum of, catastrophic events and so on. And so, we've got to remember mitigation, right? But if the globe stopped emitting any greenhouse gases today, stopped emitting, not just stabilized levels, we would still already be committed to somewhere between 1 and 3 degrees more of warming, to something like another foot of sea level rise, and all of the attendant changes that would take place. So really we need to be working on both of these fronts. And, I think the idea that we've got to choose is sort of a false dichotomy. Okay, but we're talking about why we need to be proactive on the conservation front. And the first reason we need to be proactive is the degree to which the future is diverging from anything in the recent past. So Nate Stevenson with the USGS first showed me this map a few years ago. And out with it went my idea that, local climates were going to march northward and species were going to follow, and everything was going to kind of move into a new place somewhere uphill or, up in Canada. Because what this map shows is that in all of this red, these are all areas that under a pretty consistent with current emissions scenario, that in 100 years they have conditions that will disappear from the U.S. entirely. So combinations of rainfall, soil conditions, temperature, seasonality of rainfall events, these combinations of climate and other environmental conditions that currently are what support all of the wildlife and biodiversity that occur in these areas. So, look at Montana. Basically everything you've got here, part of this is that it's moving north into Canada. But these combinations of conditions aren't going to occur anywhere anymore. And you've got these smaller areas. Orange ones will decrease in extent, but they won't disappear entirely. And then these little dots of green that are combinations of conditions that we'll expect to find in more places down the line. So it's not just a moving north into Canada thing. Across the board, there are all of these areas where conditions occur now that aren't going to exist anymore. And so to adapt our thinking about this is that species have to move. But this kind of thing raises the question of where are they going to move if they're to find the same kinds of conditions that currently support them. And so, we have to be thinking that it's not just about moving, it's also about undergoing some evolutionary changes, stretching their plasticity, their ability to flex. It's quite a bit more extreme than, maybe we are thinking when we look at the past. And that's the second point I want to make. This really isn't like past climate changes. So, nature has adapted to climate changes in the past. And this set of figures at the top here from Margaret Davis's group in Minnesota shows you this reconstruction from pollen records of the movement of spruce. It's 4 species of spruce. Northward as this blue, as the Laurentide ice sheet retreated. And so you can see that spruce moved from a center of concentration in what's now sort of the middle Midwest up into, it's almost entirely restricted to Canada, except for the spine of the Rockies is one place that we still have a lot of spruce in the US. But look at the time scale. So this migration took place over 20,000 years. And the amount of temperature change we're experiencing now over about a 100-year time period is comparable to the amount of temperature change that happened in this period. Okay, so we're talking about perhaps 100 times faster, and that rate is very, very important. The other thing that I want to point out here is that the changes occurring today are really outside of the range of variability that this post-Pleistocene response represents. So what you see down here is a picture from the Eocene. 36 million years ago, the Eocene ended, and that is the last time that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels we're at or above 500 parts per million, which is a level that we will hit in the next 50 years. We're cruising towards 400 from a baseline of 270. So 500 is not very far away. The Eocene was a really long time ago. At that time, there were palm trees in Wyoming. Sea level was 300 feet higher than it is now. So really, really different world. Not within the experience of humanity, which is on the order of 300,000 years old, and certainly not within the experience of sedentary agriculture-based humanity, which is like 10,000 years. And so that's worrying. And David Battisti at the University of Washington tells me that when you try to recreate the climate conditions of the Eocene using our current coupled atmosphere climate models, you can't get it warm enough. So, what he says is something's missing from the models. Something that we don't understand about the dynamics as CO2 levels get that high is missing from our current projections of how the climate will respond. And so that's worrying. So layered on top of how rapid this change is and how unprecedented it is, we also are looking at a world in which the adaptive capacity of nature is already really compromised for a number of reasons. 2 points I want to make. First, we've narrowed the range of diversity within species quite a bit in a couple of ways. The first way we've done this is that through selective hunting and harvesting over time, what this study by Chris Darramont and colleagues has shown is that across a huge number of species, we've selected for smaller size, smaller horns, that kind of thing. And we've also selected for slower growth rates, later age of first reproduction that's coupled to that slower growth rate. This is because, we catch the biggest fish, for instance. And so there's selection, there's pressure to stay small. What that does is reduce the ability of a fish population to grow fast. So we're narrowing diversity, and we're narrowing it in particular ways that challenge these populations to be able to rebound and respond to stresses. And then coupled with that, of course, we're reducing the distributions of all of these species quite a bit. So even species that aren't endangered, this is a figure that shows you for mammals of the world, the percentage of range that your typical mammal has lost as a function of what continent you find it on. And the global mean is about 75%. So your typical mammal, and grizzly bears are a great example. There used to be grizzly bears, where I live, in coastal California, but of course they're found in a much, much narrower range of places now than they once were. And so that means that there are fewer populations, less genetic diversity, and so on. The other huge way that adaptive capacity is now compromised is that these landscapes that species moved through in response to change in the past are really fragmented and cut up, and there are all kinds of barriers to movement now. So, this is East LA, maybe a very extreme example, but the general trend of sprawl and development and fragmentation is, it's a very global phenomenon. It's urbanization, it's agriculture, it's deforestation here in the Amazon. And so, again, we have a situation where even if species were going to be able to respond to these changes, 300 years ago, the landscapes they're moving through now are really, really much more difficult to move through. Okay, so in summary, from that first part, the points I really want to make are that this is not like anything we've faced before. And I'm sure you've all heard that a number of times, but what I'm wanting to emphasize here is that it's going to take more than just monitoring and watching and helping out here and there. My feeling is that it's going to take quite a bit of involvement for us to keep up with climate change. And that raises the question of how to be involved. Okay, so what do we aim for? We can't make nature stay the same. We know it has to change. Okay, we often aim for the past as managers. So we need to be clear about our goals. One of the guiding concepts for wilderness management, for the stewardship of protected areas and so on, has often been the past. We've pursued goals of keeping ecosystems stable, resisting change, maintaining historic scenery, particular communities of species, particular structures like, the open understory canopy, the open understory ponderosa pine forests that people encountered when they first arrived in places like Yosemite National Park. We're often looking at timescales of a few hundred years because that's what we have information about. to guide our thinking about what ecosystems are supposed to look like. And so, as I said, Yosemite is a classic place where this is the kind of management that was pursued, the kind of goal that was pursued for a very long time. But scientists like Tom Swetnam and Connie Millar, paleoecologists, talk about the importance of deeper historical perspectives on variability and change, and the differences between paleoecological and historical perspectives. This graph shows, this is just one example, over a pretty long time period here, but really not long compared to the hundreds of thousands of years I was just talking about, shows you the number of fire events reconstructed from tree rings in Sequoia National Park. And the dotted line is temperatures reconstructed from isotopes in those same tree rings. And what you can see is that, if you're looking at the last, say, 200, 250 years, you're getting a very distorted slice of the range of variability, both in fire frequency, right? You're missing everything above this line in terms of the number of fire events per year, and in terms of temperature. Part of that is because it's too narrow a slice, and part of it is because it's a slice that already bears the mark of all of this human influence. Okay, now I already made this point, aiming for the recent past won't work because climate change is altering conditions so dramatically. So, some other options. I'm going to propose this typology of types of goals for stewardship. You can aim for what was in some form in the past. You can also manage systems for what will be, for the future. Or you can go after what we want. Now, I've already talked about some of the problems with this first one. What about these other two? So how about the future? If we know where things are headed, and we have a lot of trend data and model data to help us understand that, our aim could be to get there with a minimum of trouble, maybe by getting species to where they need to be in the future as their habitat warms and changes. And that's a good idea. It should be part of our strategy. But it does have this limitation, which is basically that we don't always know what's going to happen. Okay, so here's a set of species and ecosystems that have been carefully studied in an effort to predict responses to climate change. They're from all over the world. In some cases, they're species. In other cases, they're whole ecosystems. And in every case, they've yielded very, very context-dependent results. So results where the different life stages of the same species respond in opposite directions. Findings where the direction of response to warming depends on whether you include projected levels of nitrogen pollution or not. Cases where the direction of response to climate change, not just the magnitude, but also the direction, depends on whether you're looking at a population in one area or in another. And I love this quote in the middle. Some effects are inconsistent between species and areas, some in opposite directions at different stages of breeding and life cycles, and others remain paradoxical. So we're not going to be able to sort this out at a fine scale, what's going to happen. And I think the future is a really, really useful thing to aim for at coarse scales, but when you're getting down to brass tacks, you don't know. And then the other problem, of course, with the future is that we might not like it, right? We might not like where things are going. Which brings us to this third type of goal, managing for the things that we want. And this has become a very popular thing lately. I don't think that people refer to it in that way, but we talk a lot these days about managing for ecosystem functions and ecosystem services, for forage and for clean water and filtration and carbon sequestration and wildlife and wildflowers and so on. And I think that there's a really important place for what we want. This is a system where I work back in California. It's called Coyote Ridge. It's this incredible global hotspot of biodiversity within California for plants. And invasive grasses and nitrogen pollution are taking a toll on this system and turning it into something that looks more and more like this. And people don't like that. They really like the wildflowers. You can't walk through this. It's full of this spiny invasive species called star thistle that kind of hits you in the knees. And so they're pulling out all the stops. Conservation grazing, spraying herbicides, prescribed fire. Lately, some efforts to change nitrogen management policy in the whole Bay Area to try to reduce pollution loads. All with these goals that, of course, are motivated in part by biodiversity protection. This is an endangered butterfly species that gives leverage from a policy perspective, but mobilized very much by what they want. And so the fact of change need not mean that we accept change. Maybe we will decide to water some Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Monument, so that, to change the name. Maybe we'll put out carrion for scavengers when mild winters stop providing as much carrion as those scavengers need, or, continue to stock lakes with fish, things like that. But like the other things, there are some problems with what we want. First of all, who's we? Who gets included in defining this? Is it voters? Is it people who go to public meetings? What about children? What about, how far away do you have to live from the ecosystem in question before you get excluded from this we? They both came up. Second problem is that, what we want will inevitably change. It'll change over time. It'll probably change over time too fast for management to respond. And, with potential downsides for what our kids and grandkids are going to get left with. So, do we keep changing our tactics? How often do we revise and revisit this question of what it is that we want if we're going to pursue what we want as a goal for ecosystem management? And then, of course, we don't necessarily know everything, right? I would assert that we don't know enough to know how to get what we want in the long term. Maybe we know how to do it in the short term, but we have learned this lesson over and over again. You need to be careful about engineering ecosystems for what we want. That has gotten us into plenty of trouble, and this is one of my favorite examples. This is the cane toad. Cane toad was introduced intentionally to Western Australia up here. Why? Because it eats a pest of sugarcane, and so sugarcane growers in this area needed some help dealing with these pests. The cane toad was introduced. Now it is considered one of the worst 18 exotic species in the world. It's poisonous. It's so dense that you can't avoid hitting them when you're driving down the road in certain parts of the region. And it continues to spread. And of course someone thought this was something that we wanted. And so, I think we have to remember that we need to have humility when we're pursuing functional goals with stewardship. Okay, so now I've kind of knocked all three of these out. And I want to bring them back in part. And, I think the upshot is that there are problems with each of these, so we need a hybrid approach that draws on all three. One that includes some active pursuit of what's going to happen in the future, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. And one that makes sure that, we keep the things we really want to keep. And then there's this question of history and what was. And what I would say is that, we do need to lean on the past, maybe in a different way than we have so far. But, we need the past. I think it's really, really dangerous to abandon the baseline that we have in the past, to forge ahead after sort of designer novel ecosystems based on a combination of unavoidable realities and lists of functions that we want to obtain. Who knows what that would yield? We need a more enduring guide, and that's what the past can provide. But we do need to be looking much deeper into the past than the last few hundred years. We need to be looking not at past assemblages, past particular mosaics in the landscape, but at broader characteristics and processes. And then we need to be doing it for different purposes. And the way I would sum that up is that we don't want to keep things looking the same, but we want to enable adaptive change at a level that was possible in the past. Another way of saying that is that we don't necessarily want the past as a guide to where ecosystems should be going. We want the past as a guide to where ecosystems should be coming from. And in particular, I mean where they should be coming from in terms of their capacity to adapt, which is another way of saying their past resilience. That capacity depends on a whole range of things, and these are some of the big ones. It depends on native levels of biodiversity, not necessarily the same species in every place, but at least a comparable variety of genes and species in the regional pool. It depends on different aspects of ecological complexity, a comparably complex mosaic on the landscape, whether it's of different age forest stands or different ecosystem types. Comparable level of food web and interaction web complexity. So not systems that have been simplified to the point where there really aren't very many connections anymore to break. Comparable in terms of evolutionary capacity, so this means genetic diversity, but also sort of, the evolutionary rates of change in the past, the suite of evolutionary pressures that organisms have experienced in the past, and then some core functions as well. Core functions like primary productivity, because that undergirds, it fuels the entire food web. Other core functions might be disturbances that maintain diversity and spatial complexity. And so we need to be looking farther back, and then we need to be looking for these kinds of features, again, with an eye not to keeping them the same, but to keeping comparable levels of them. And I want to contrast resilience with another concept, resistance, to make this a little more clear. So here's another way of defining resilience. It gets defined in all kinds of slightly different ways. I like this definition. It's the capacity to weather shocks and stresses without a fundamental loss of character. And resistance is different. Resistance is about bouncing back to the same place as quickly as possible, kind of like a rubber band. But the analogy that people often use for resilience is this idea of a ball sort of rolling around in this big basin, and the basin is full of all kinds of different states that an ecosystem can be in. It can, the ball can be here, the ball's the ecosystem, or it can be here or here. So it moves around in response to different forces that push it up and down, but it's able to, stay somewhere in this basin, or maybe it flips over into a slightly different state for a while. This is a grassland and this is a woodland. The key being that it's relatively difficult, if this is a resilient system, to knock the ball up over here where it just kind of rolls off into oblivion. Okay? So the idea is that it's about facilitating change within bounds. And I'll assert, or admit, that the science of resilience is really, really in its infancy. I feel like it remains more of a metaphor than something that we can measure. But it's an increasingly useful one. It's a useful principle to guide our thinking. And then there's pretty good agreement that these are some of the core features that confer this capacity to weather shocks and stresses. So these are the kinds of things we need to build. Okay, to sum up this part, we can't make ecosystems stay the same in the face of climate change. So we have to aim for this combination of past capacity, or better. Maybe we need to aim for better. Maybe we can in some places aim for even better capacity. In other words, resilience. And then combined with future realities and enduring functions. So, functions like averting landslides and catastrophic wildfires, functions we can all sort of agree are things that we want to be able to lean on. And so resilience is central, but I want to underscore this now. It's not enough. Okay? I'm going to say more about that in a minute. I think this stuff down here takes more than just boosting resilience. It's going to take more proactive steps, like helping species move to new places, in some cases that will sustain them, like maybe maintaining or rebuilding soils in places that have been racked by newly intense disturbances. It's not just about trying to get ecosystems to the point where they can cope with all of this on their own. So in some places and for some targets, we can focus on building resilience of the current system, identifying what elements of it most need a boost. And then in other cases, we're going to need more than build resilience. And I want to introduce this other term, this other concept, the concept of transformation. And this is kind of a new thing, this idea of transformation ecology. So the idea is that, there will come a point in certain places or for particular species where the goal of sort of pursuing the resilience of the current system goes out the window because change is just going to be too dramatic. And your alternatives are to watch the system that you've been managing sort of die a slow death, or to play an active role in the transformation of that system to something very different. And one of the places that this has been talked about a lot in very controversial ways, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So this is a system that, is hit from all sides. It's got bleaching problems because of temperature increases. Ocean acidification is really taking a toll as well, and threatening at some point to dissolve the entire reef. And then there's pollution runoff and overfishing from the coast of Western Australia. So all of these things mean that people who are trying to conserve the Great Barrier Reef are working really, really hard, and some of them are asking, at what point do we say, this is not going to be a coral reef anymore in 100 years? What is it going to be besides a desert, a biological desert, and how can we help it get there? That's a really, really difficult thing to contemplate a totally different cast of species, a totally new set of disturbance regimes, something very, very different than what we now cherish. But I think sometimes, that's what people are faced with. Another example are people who work in the very far north. I worked with some folks at TNC who are managing walrus conservation. They're thinking about conservation of polar bears. And that is a system where there isn't any north for things to move to. There isn't any colder for things to move to. And so the kinds of steps that they're contemplating are, pretty radical, have to do with blurring the distinctions among populations that have been distinct for a very long time, for instance, in the name of keeping the species from disappearing. Now there's also this other end of the spectrum over here. I just told you that resistance is, kind of a different idea, kind of a keep it the same thing, something that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense in the context of climate change. But as I said before, there are places and cases where that's the only way to go. If you have a species that's restricted to bogs in Yellowstone or to vernal pools in the Central Valley of California, and they're disappearing because of drought, and there's nowhere else with the same soil type, maybe you're going to water them. Maybe you're going to take some dramatic steps to keep from having to just move all your specimens to a botanical garden. Okay, so how do we get there? Well, we have so little time today, but I just want to make a few key points. So first of all, it's important to tackle both the broad work of building resilience and this more sort of specific and maybe cutting-edge work of assisting transformation. And why am I saying this? I see people arguing about this all the time. Is this the right way to do adaptation, or is this the right way to do adaptation? This is too risky, and we're going to be wrong, and this is too weak, and it's lame, and it's not going to get us there. Well, from my perspective, it's a ridiculous argument, because the safest approach is a diverse one that is going to both involve building resilience through strengthening the kinds of things that we already do, monitoring wildlife, monitoring ecosystems, detecting change as it's occurring so that we can respond to it, managing adaptively in response to that information that we're obtaining, continuing to pursue the tools of conservation that we know work, mitigating other threats besides climate change so that systems have more capacity to respond to climate change, protecting areas that we can protect. And that doesn't necessarily mean sticking them in parks. That may mean, brokering more agreements with landowners that, just allow for more connectivity and movement through landscapes that are working landscapes. So a strategy that includes these kinds of things and then also starts to look ahead to preempting specific expectations about what's going to happen under climate change. This is much more new stuff, but it's not stuff that has not been done before. Here we're talking about things like whether we're going to translocate species to future habitats, whether we're going to think about protecting areas that maybe wouldn't be our first choices now, but are going to become really important for refugia down the line as species are moving. The second thing I want to say here is that there are all these great tools for decision making under uncertainty. And one of the features of climate change that's really, really challenging for decision makers is that there's all this uncertainty. There's all this, what if we do thing A and then, what we're expecting to have happen doesn't happen. It gets wetter instead of drier. Or maybe, in this particular spot, snowpack goes up and doesn't go down because there are all sorts of, complex interactions taking place that produce uncertainty that paralyze us. But there are all of these tools available to help guide decision making under those conditions. We have a lot of trend and model information that we can incorporate into decisions. I'm not sure why that's happening, but, and specifically incorporate them using tools like scenario-based planning and sensitivity analysis. And I'll talk for just a minute about this tool. So scenario-based planning comes from the business community. And it's a tool that large corporations, most prominently oil companies, actually Shell and BP have used scenario-based planning for decades now to chart long-term strategic business plans, to decide, to make big decisions about where to build infrastructure and develop and drill over the next 30 to 50 years. To what extent to begin investing in fuels beyond fossil-derived fuels. BP in particular is kind of well known for using scenario-based planning to decide that it can't stay only in fossil fuels because it's seeing, as an organization, a time when that's not going to be viable. And the National Park Service now uses scenario-based planning as well. and Glacier National Park was one of the first ones to use scenarios to do some thinking about what they might want to do differently when they start looking at longer time horizons, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, and start incorporating all this information about climate change and using it to think about what might happen in the future, how it might unfold. So what are scenarios? Scenarios basically are stories that stretch thinking. And what you do is you develop scenarios particular to the place that you're working. So if you're in Joshua Tree National Monument, you would develop scenarios about how the future might unfold in Joshua Tree National Monument in terms of not just climate change, but maybe also things like visitor use or development pressure. Typically what you're doing is you're developing a set of 3 or 4 different stories that represent divergent but plausible paths, okay, plausible futures. And the reason you want them to be really different is because one of the things that people do with scenarios is they say, okay, so the future could go this way, or it could go that way, or it could go that way. We don't know, right? We're uncertain. But let's think about what we could do now that would work, that would make things better, regardless of whether this or this or this happens. And so because they are plausible futures, and because you're using a set of them, they're hypotheses, they're not predictions. And so they're a way of moving away from getting hung up on the question of whether the predictions are right? It doesn't matter. You can not even be comfortable with the idea that climate change is happening and use scenarios as a way, like many of these large corporations do, to think about how the future might unfold in these different directions, maybe no climate change, maybe climate change, and what you can do now that will work well under all those situations. So it's a great tool to navigate change. And the key is that it's a tool that we're taking from the business community. Now the Park Service is using it. It has to be tailored every time it's taken to a new scale, to a new setting, so that people can really use it to identify priority concerns and actions that would work. So I'm working with the state of California now, and a team that includes Rebecca Shaw, who's now at the Environmental Defense Fund, a woman named Sarah Moore, who's in my group at UCSC. And so what we're trying to do is tailor the scenario-based planning tool to the California situation, where we're working in landscapes, kind of like here, with dozens of different agencies and stewards, and with the need to coordinate responses across all of these different jurisdictions where fragmentation is high, where human population density is high. I can't talk in detail about how we're tailoring this process to California, but I can tell you a little bit about the kinds of decisions that are coming out of this. So this is a group of managers, or part of a group of managers from 15 different agencies and organizations in West Marin County, which is the county just north of San Francisco, across the Golden Gate. So it's a really, really biodiverse county, and it's a really, really crowded county. It's also pretty affluent, which is sometimes a help and sometimes a hindrance. And so, among other things, what came out of, in this case, this was a 2-day process that was started with a series of phone calls where part of this group developed the scenarios that they were going to use. And so this group took the scenarios, developed them further, and did a bunch of talking about what they, across all of these different jurisdictions, could agree would be good steps to take once they're looking at this long term. And at that big coordinated level, one of the things they do is they're developing a memorandum of understanding across all of these agencies to coordinate some things regionally, like an interagency rapid response team, to respond to the aftermath of things like wildfires and landslides with restoration that is targeted to addressing sort of the future conditions of climate change, rather than just targeted to make things the way they were before the catastrophic event. And then at a finer scale, the scenarios can also guide these individual decisions. So less than a couple of weeks after this workshop, which we held in January, this is a woman named Bree Hardcastle. She's a scientist for the state parks in Marin County. And she called us a couple of weeks after the workshop to tell us basically that she was looking at a plan to build some freshwater ponds for the red-legged frog, which is an endangered species in California, in lowland coastal California. And so she was looking at this particular location near the coast. They had a plan to build these ponds for these frogs. And she wanted to tell us that she'd scrapped the plan. Why? She went down to look at them again after the workshop, and they were not too far from a saltwater estuary. And so, all this sort of longer term thinking, scenarios, whatever, led her to realize that those ponds were going to work out really well for some time, 10 years, 20 years, maybe 30, but then the estuary was rising, and that's something that we were all clear on in the workshop. And they weren't going to work anymore, so they were moving them higher ground. And the point there is that, so there's a role for incorporating climate change at this really, really big level, right? All this regional coordination and stuff like that. And there's also a role for incorporating it into these very individual decisions that we make, that people and agencies make, that landowners make. And it really has to do with, sort of a new thinking that can pervade the decisions that we make that involves taking a long view and sort of incorporating all of this information that we're accumulating about what's likely to happen. So each scale has these particular roles. If you manage a small reserve, you might be very much pursuing transformation, receiving new species, facilitating the movement of old species, and I don't just mean out of your reserve. We often see that species that are expected to move, very much like north and out of whole protected areas are not doing that. When we look at them on the ground, what they're doing is they're getting more constricted, right? They're getting more constricted around water bodies or more constricted around shallow groundwater tables or to higher elevations. So there's a local scale for movement as well as this large scale one. Maybe at the local level, you're maintaining the stage. You're not necessarily going to have the same vegetation, but you're trying to maintain vegetation, a landscape mosaic, hydrological dynamics, some basic things so that as things are moving through, as species are coming through, there is a place there for them to persist. The local scale is the best scale for piloting projects. And part of a resilience-based approach is that there's this constant learning and experimentation involved. And we try to think big about what kinds of adaptation steps we can pursue at these large scales. That's efficient, it's easy, it's also kind of a World Bank approach because you never know whether things are going to work the first time around. And so pilot projects are something that can happen in a replicated way or with variations across local sites. And then the other thing I want to point out really strongly is that individual parks, preserves, and so on are the best scale to take local knowledge, apply it, bring it up to the level where it can sit alongside all of these climate models and so on, and can sort of be an equal partner in informing what we're going to do going forward. So I can't emphasize enough how valuable a local understanding of the dynamics of the system that you're working in, how valuable that is. It's as valuable, if not more valuable, than bringing in all of these complicated climate models and so on. And then, of course, there are these really, really important roles for entities at regional and continental scales to play. Maybe those are the best scales to think about building connectivity and helping to maintain species as they move through all of these different landscapes. For example, the US and Canada and Mexico now have a series of agreements to guide coordination as particular species move out of one country and into another one. For instance, the jaguar, Mexico is seeing that species move north into the US more and more, and so there are coordinated agreements now to help that transfer happen smoothly. This is the right scale for coordination, for building communication across all of these individual jurisdictions and so on. So I think there's a really, really important piece of this, which is not just thinking longer term, it's also thinking larger scale. At the scale of counties, at the scale of the entire country, there are some things that need to come from above, and those include funding, right? All of this has to be paid for. Criteria and guidance. One of the things that I see happening is that people are reinventing the wheel in different places, trying to figure out how to pursue adaptation, trying to figure out what are the right kinds of actions to pursue and which ones aren't. And I think there's real value in synchronizing these efforts and then making sure that everyone is thinking about some basic things about effectiveness and feasibility and reversibility and minimizing non-target effects and so on. And that's especially important as we start to think about things like moving species to new places where they don't currently occur. Finally, these large scales, the scale of the region, the scale of the continent, that's where maybe we don't have to think so much about transformation, because these are the scales at which we can think about the current suite of species and facilitating their resilient responses to all of this change. Okay, I better wrap up. 8 o'clock. So in closing, I just want to return briefly to my 3 main points. The first one is that we need to be proactive if we want to sustain a nature that is livable. Right? Nature is going to do fine without us, but we're not necessarily going to do so fine with that nature. Who's we? Who needs to be proactive? It's all of us. For one thing, by reminding our political representatives all the time, over and over again, that this is important. They should be creating mandates for it. They need to fund it. The biggest thing that I hear over and over again is that people don't have money for this. They don't have money to hold a planning session, let alone to implement any of the ideas that come out of that planning session. And that money has to come probably foremost from government. And then when I say, sustain nature, we can't make it stay the same, so that's not what I mean. What I mean is that, we need to enable adaptive change. So we need to pursue resilience, we need to bolster that, and then think about actively assisting transformation where general resilience isn't enough to get systems through this anymore. How do we do this? The good news is that we have all kinds of tools to do this. We have great conservation tools. We have great tools from other sectors like scenario-based planning. The challenge is that we don't use them enough, and then we need to use them better, with longer term and larger scale issues in mind, with more coordination, right, to link small efforts in each place with overarching efforts at regional and continental scales. And in closing, I encourage everyone to see this as an opportunity. I really think, this is a huge challenge. It's daunting, it's expensive, it's scary, and it's also an opportunity to grow the science of conservation, the art of conservation in ways that we haven't before, to make it more effective than it ever has been, and to strengthen and build these networks of communities, of people, and so on who are working towards this shared goal of stewarding nature through climate change. So I think this is really something we can do. It's an opportunity to pull it off, and in the process come away with better connections with the communities around us and so on. And if we start now, we can do it. So I have a lot of people to thank. I most of all want to thank Lori for inviting me out. And I want to thank you all for listening. So I'd be happy to take questions. Should I call on folks? Okay, yeah, sir.
How much does geographic information systems programming play into all of this, all your projections and so forth?
That's a great question. So the question is, how much do geographic information systems play into all of this? And I don't even know where to start with that because it's such a critical tool to so much of this. I think one of the things I didn't say is that this is also a challenge to think spatially more than we have in the past, perhaps, because we have to be thinking about, we need to be thinking spatially about barriers to movement, but we also need to be thinking spatially about where things are going to move at different scales, within reserves, at continental scales, and so on. And so I think that is a tool that has been totally fundamental to all of this, to the climate models, to the species models, and to planning efforts. Thanks. Other questions? Yeah.
The animals in the ways in the past actually have more of an adaptive capacity, like if you look at genetic variation and actually improve that?
So that's a great question. Again, a complicated question. Do we know that animals, that species in the past had more adaptive capacity? In the strict sense, in the genetic sense, yes, there are tools to look at that. So one of the things that basically conservation genetics has become conservation genomics now, which basically means that you can do things like you can take samples from a modern day population of, for instance, a whale whose population size has declined dramatically, and you can use today's variation of microsatellite loci to infer what the population size was before whaling, that kind of thing. So we're able to reconstruct the size of populations in the past to say something about their past genetic diversity. And then some of this is also making inferences from first principles. So, when I say that mammals in general have lost genetic diversity, some of that comes from studies where people have looked at the number of populations that there used to be of species, 20, 30, 80 different populations, and compared that to now, where maybe there are 4 or 5 populations left of the same species, and we're making an inference that means that genetic diversity is lower, and it certainly means that the number of populations out there, to persist if a catastrophic event takes out some of them is going to be lower. So I would say, yeah, in general, yeah, we can say that with some solid evidence. It's probably not true for every single species. It's probably not true for the Norway rat, for instance, right? There are certainly species that have benefited a lot from all of the changes that have happened in the last couple hundred years. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
It seems logical to implement a pilot project for scenarios such as assisted migration. And I'm wondering if you know of any examples of such pilot projects.
That's a great question. Okay, so are there examples of assisted migration already happening? I think, one of the places that's pursuing this kind of stuff the most actively is Australia. Australia and New Zealand both have really, really aggressive departments of conservation under different names. And so Australia is a place where there's already been, and New Zealand too, there have already been translocations of species, not so much because of climate change, because it's actually something they've done for a while, but they've done translocations of populations to new places because the former range is, it's completely under threat. And most often, that's because they're invasive species that have made it impossible for, say the kiwi in New Zealand to persist in its former distribution. So they move it out and start a population on an islet off the main island where it's never occurred before. They've been doing that for a while. Sort of the logical next question is, well, does it work and what happens and so on? And yeah, I think that, the big answer to that is it depends. And there are so many, there's such a huge gradient of ways that can happen. Are you moving it really far, just moving it a little bit? Are you helping it across a highway? Or are you taking it to like a different, how far are you moving it? What's there? Is there something that's really similar that it's going to compete with potentially? Are you putting something else at risk? All of those are questions that people need to be asking. Yes, other questions? Comments? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the importance of local knowledge, especially the way that can be melded with current science, just the modes that you've seen that work most effectively.
So incorporating local knowledge into thinking about what to do going forward. Well, let me start out by answering that this way. That's a great question. And there are a couple of different ways I can answer it, but I'm going to pick one and go with it. So one of the things that I took part in, it's kind of been a 5-year process now, is this conservation and climate change working group that has been centered around Yellowstone National Park. And we sort of went into that with a scenario-based approach, kind of, but felt like we wanted to try to keep it as open as possible and see what worked for people. Well, it turned out that, when we got down to thinking about what kinds of things people might want to do differently in the face of climate change, all of the thinking about what those steps might look like involved talking through, well, what is the natural history of the wolves in this park, and what is the natural history of the beavers in this park, and what do we know? What is the long-term trend? We really had to spend like a whole bunch of time putting together a very detailed conceptual ecological map that drew on people just talking about, well, what do grizzly bears do when they come out of their dens early, and where are they doing that, and use that both to figure out what parts of the system were really linked up, and then to figure out, which ones are most vulnerable to the climate changes, to think about where the intervention points might really be that could make a difference. All of that wasn't really so much coming from any of the climate model stuff. I mean, we up front used some model data to think about what are the right ranges to be thinking about? How much warmer, how much drier is the Yellowstone River going to get? How much is snowpack going to decline? Get some of that stuff straight. But then from there forward, it was really just all about getting all of the natural history right and the ecology. And I think that I see that happening over and over again. That really what people need is not a laundry list of generic actions they might take. What they need is some clear ideas about the ranges of possible futures, and then a whole bunch of talking and sharing information about how does the system work, what happens when you jiggle this, what are all the pieces that move, and what are the trends people are seeing. And I've also encountered that working with indigenous groups I worked a few years ago, did a scenario-based planning process with a group of Hopi and Pueblo farmers who are connected by this network of acequias in New Mexico, these water canals that they maintain and dig. Boy, it was great, because I was supposed to give this talk on the second day, sort of lining out some of the major, just region-specific climate change trends that were happening. And they got them all themselves on the first day. Like every single one of them, they had already been observing. I mean, all of them, even ones that had to do with songbirds laying earlier, and So, I mean, and then there's a great observational network out there that's actually web-based. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's this thing that you can go and sort of enter in your observations about how climate change is affecting things. So all of that, I'm rambling just to say that I think, I can't overemphasize what an important piece that is. And I think that gets lost when people are thinking about, what's the national adaptation policy going to be? What's the menu of options and strategies to choose from? Yeah, very important to keep.
Erica, what advice would you give to our undergraduate students who are studying climate change and interested in conservation and sort of how to be involved?
Whew. What advice would I give undergrads who are studying climate change and conservation to be involved? Maybe building on that last answer I gave, I think it's really, really valuable to get to know an area well. And when I say an area, I don't just mean the natural history. I mean, this is one thing that, I've learned over time too. You get to know sort of the natural history, all the players, and then start to see some trends for yourself. And, my sense is that those are the people who have some sort of deep knowledge of a particular place and, thorough familiarity with, who all the different people are who should be talking to each other, for instance, who are really going to be in good positions to broker all of that coordination and communication and, to get people's energy focused on the right things to be thinking about in a particular area, because they really are different from place to place. I mean, there are some common issues across areas. Wildfire is a big one here and in California, but then they really diverge. I mean, there's so many things that I know about in California. There are probably a whole bunch of things here like that too that I don't know about, but that seem very different. They're very different issues, and they're a product both of the different ecology of that system and of the different institutional and social makeup of that area. So that's a pretty generic answer. Maybe in terms of studies and in terms of coursework, I'm in an environmental studies department, but I have a background in biology, and one of the things that I've really, really enjoyed is getting my thinking stretched over time, spending all of this time around people who study policy and geography and sociology and political science and so on, having them stretch my thinking about what the role of ecology is in addressing these problems, and where its role is limited too. So, I mean, I guess the advice that stems from that is that it's really, really useful to become expert in a particular discipline, and then to match that with some good understanding of the basics in a whole range of disciplines and maybe a whole range of sectors too, so that you can make your expertise useful, so that you can connect it up to what other people are doing effectively. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about education and how we might be able to increase ecological awareness amongst younger people and sort of keep this ball rolling.
Yeah. Boy, that's a great issue to be talking about, because I think probably the biggest problem, the one that I have the least idea how to tackle exactly, but I know it's the most important one to tackle, is that most of the U.S. isn't where climate change is happening. And what I mean by that is that most of the U.S., more than 50% of the population, spends less than an hour a day physically outside, total, counting everything, getting out of the car and going to the grocery store. I mean, there's some number of people in the U.S., it's like 40-something%, who actually don't go outside. They get into their car through their garage inside door, drive somewhere, park in an underground parking structure, go to work, go downstairs, do a drive-through, and they don't go outside at all. So if people aren't going outside at all, what do they care? What the climate is, unless their house burns down. And the reason I'm saying that is I think that there are really two kinds of education. One is very specific. It's environmental literacy, it's climate literacy, it's understanding the way all these things are connected. And the other is very general, it's very broad. It's getting people the hell outside. And maybe that's less of a problem here, I don't know. But I do think that, we can't neglect either one of those. And so that's my soapbox about that. I just feel like the most fundamental thing is to get people outside, familiar with natural history, in a position to be able to detect themselves that stuff's different, and then in a position to be able to be intelligent about, climate change is not actually happening more on warm days when you ask them than on cold days when you ask them. That's not how, to get people sort of more in tune with the way the weather works and the way climate works. So, like I said, maybe that's not exactly the answer that you need here in Montana, because I think my sense is people actually do go outside here quite a bit, and they do in California too. But and then on the environmental literacy side and the climate information side, it's a little bit of a tough row to hoe. It's really easy to preach to the converted, like I'm doing, I think, for the most part. But I think that some of the most important places to be pursuing this stuff are, with young kids. Environmental ed at sort of grade school level is, and I'm saying environmental ed and outdoor ed, super, super important. Probably your best chance to catch people and change the way that they view the world permanently. And, but that goes on up to college. I'm so stoked that you guys have a program here, you have a minor in climate change. Is that what it's actually called? Yeah, it's climate change studies. Yeah, so there's certainly opportunities to do that here. But then again, the trick is to get it to people who aren't choosing on their own to focus on it. Yes?
There's a new program at the journalism school, an environmental journalism program. If anybody in this room has writing skills where they can take the technical jargon that you deal with and put it in language that individuals that aren't in your field, then for heaven's sake, consider the possibility of being a journalist and describing this to the general public.
Fantastic, thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there's another piece of advice that I could have said is that learn to write. So even if you're not going to go be a journalist, learn to write, because it's going to be like your main way of communicating with other people about this and your main way of being effective, probably, unless you really, really get on a big public speaking tour or something. So, yeah.
I kind of think about the values of human ecology and examples in China and India, and how those are future scenarios of possibility, with population and stresses and what we've seen happening there. And then I think, of the, what we would hope to see happen here. We've already see examples of what, dealing with the human element. Do we deal with that first, or do we deal with that later? And I think that until we really grasp that concept, that I think we're, some of these scenarios are based on kind of what we wish would happen.
So, I think it was Lori who was just telling me about, a study to try to figure out how to address energy needs in California. And the constraint was without behavior change. Like you can't even go there, right? You can do technology, you can do nuclear, you can do, any existing technology goes. And hundreds of thousands of acres of solar panels goes, but no behavior change allowed. Because of, this gentleman's question, education, like how, so getting people to change what they're doing is really, really hard. And I think honestly, so I came to biology from human ecology. That was what I was doing as an anthropologist. And I think, the sort of the biggest question there, and it's sort of reemerging in this field called conservation psychology now, is, how do you get people to change their behavior? How do you get people to forego short-term benefits in exchange for long-term gains?
You never showed that capacity.
Or when we do, it's under very, very particular conditions. Yeah, but it does happen. And I think that's, that's a really important lesson. I haven't thought a whole lot about how to take those lessons from, traditional, maybe 10,000, 50,000 people size societies and transfer them to what's now this sort of globally connected enormous mass of billions of people. But yeah, I think that's critical. There was a question up here, or comment.
Yeah, for some species that are maybe more vulnerable to extinction or something like that, which ones do we pick to protect, I guess? I mean, 'cause there's, like amphibians or fish who are more susceptible oftentimes to like things like that. Like, how do we pick which ones we want to protect and save, even if there's more money in protecting species?
How do we pick which species to save? So how do you practice triage? That's a hard question. And I think it's such a hard question that it's controversial. I don't even know if it's controversial because there's controversy about whether we have to pick. I think it's just whether people can stomach the idea that we have to pick. And, like you said, sometimes the choice has to do with funding. There's just only so much money, and and that's the way conservation works. I mean, there's just not a lot of money for it compared to other things. So yeah, we do have to make choices. And then sometimes there are these hard biological constraints. Things are going to go extinct because there is nowhere left for them to live, or they're going to go into a zoo or a seed bank or something like that. It's such a hard topic to even talk about. Species are going to go extinct because of climate change. That day that I spent with the Nature Conservancy's polar group, who are working on walrus and polar bear and that was one of the most depressing experiences of my career as a biologist, because they were talking around all of these different ideas about what to do for walrus and coming up pretty dry. There's just no getting away from the fact that, they need to be on the shallow continental shelf there on the northern end of whether it's Asia or Europe or North America. But they also need sea ice, and the sea ice is moving further and further away from that continental shelf. So, what are you going to build platforms, way out north off? That's what they're talking about doing now, but that's the kind of thing where, you do see people deciding that they're not going to put their energy there anymore. And I think the truth is that how those decisions get made is really idiosyncratic. It's not very systematic. I don't know if that's going to change, just because it's such a hard topic for people to talk about. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, hi.
What's the chances of pulling this off? We've had 2-3 billion year window of opportunity in the galaxy for other civilizations to pull it off, and apparently they haven't.
Or they figured out to keep themselves. What's the chances we're going to pull it? I think the nice thing about this is that there's a big gray area. Maybe we can define some like succeed or fail threshold. Maybe it's whether we're around to talk about it afterwards.
I'd like to see Bach and skiing going on for a good long while.
Yeah. I'm one of the people in my lab group right now is this woman named Holly Jones, and what she works on is how fast ecosystems can recover from severe disturbances. And it's incredibly good news a lot of the time. One of the things I'm learning from her is that ecosystems are pretty darn resilient. You can lop off a mountaintop in West Virginia and you will have something back besides bare rock, like much more quickly than you might have thought. So, like I said, is nature going to go on? Of course it is. It's going to do, it's going to do fine in some form. And then I think the same thing probably goes for people in places like the U.S. The tough thing about climate change when we're talking about, the human front is that the places where people are going to get hit hardest for the most part are the places where people have the least voice or ability to do anything about it. And so, I feel like at a personal level, I'm pretty comfortable that, I'm going to be skiing and listening to music and whatever else, and my kids are, and so on. But, the raw edge to that is that there are a whole bunch of people who aren't going to be so well off. And that's what to say. I think, at some level, we have to be motivated by what's going to happen to people really, really far away from us if we're going to be worried about the worst effects of climate change. We've got to be thinking about Bangladesh and the Pacific Islands and places like that. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is, part of the wilderness lecture series, and I was curious, do you feel like wilderness in the future is going to be as relevant or more relevant, less relevant with climate change impact?
What an interesting question. So I think it depends on how you define wilderness, right? Is wilderness this is, thanks to David Cole and Lori helping me think about this last few years, is wilderness the absence of people intervening? Or is it the absence of people having an impact? Because, if it's the absence of people having an impact, you're right, there's not a whole lot of places left where you're going to have, no human impact anymore, right? Probably none. I'm looking at that ball. Antarctica, the North Pole, places where there aren't any people really have a clear signal of human impact now. So are they still wilderness? Well, from an experiential point of view, probably they still are. I think from an experiential point of view, wilderness is going to, stay relevant. From an ecological point of view, is there going to be any true wilderness out there in 100 years? I would argue that if that's the way you're defining it, if you're defining it as the absence of human impact, there already isn't any. But that's okay. So I don't think that's necessarily the only way to define it. Lori said I worked in the Frank Church Wilderness for a while, many, many years ago, and I went back to the Frank Church a few years ago, which is, it's a 2.1 million acre wilderness. It's big. And there's very, very little use there. And it's radically changed. It had changed a lot in the 15 years since I'd been there before, mostly because of wildfire and the reintroduction of wolves. So two things kind of going in different directions from the perspective of change from past baselines. But, could you still go there and reconnect, whatever that is, connect with landscapes that are relatively free of human influence? Yes. And in that sense, I think it's, it stays completely relevant as long as we maintain some places that are like that. Yeah.
Okay, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking Eric.